The theme of this year's meeting of Friends of Europe is stubborn optimism. And so I was asked to address this topic tonight, and I'll be honest, I struggled. But I managed, but maybe not exactly the way Geert had in mind. I just returned to Europe, quote unquote, after spending 5 years at Stanford, so my remarks tonight benefit from that perspective a little bit as well. The perspective is that Europe can be too stubborn and too optimistic from time to time. I'll give you 4 illustrations. One is the handling of the anti-democratic forces in our midst, with an approach of it being better to be in the tent pissing out instead of addressing the pissing. Having parties in the families of the European Christian Democrats, for example, like Viktor Orban's party, making very distinct anti-democratic moves and being tolerated that way is one example. But I'm also thinking about the overly optimistic expectations about what appeasement of Putin and diplomacy vis-à-vis Russia could lead to, and the consequences that we face of that kind of optimism. In Ukraine, while Russia started a war of aggression and turned his economy into a war economy, we were arguing on the basis of principles that it was the best approach for the EU to support the Ukrainians, to defend themselves, and to really stick to the borders of NATO. Very optimistic about a largely US-led strategy, encouraging the Ukrainians to be capable of doing what is needed to defend themselves. It's proven to be overly optimistic. Then in Gaza, the word stubborn doesn't cover it, but we Europeans have done the opposite. We have actually pushed aside principles, and I see it as a deep abdication of responsibility when it comes to morals, when it comes to the promise of believing in the universality of people's human rights and a rules-based order. We have not only condoned, but even supported the same kind of violence and aggression and crimes against innocent people that we condemn so convincingly elsewhere. Another stubborn notion is the way in which the EU can think about its own successes in governing. Only in Europe can a solution, a newly adopted law, be presented as being great because it does better or more than what others do, or because it does more than was done in the past. Then an answer is a good answer because it's been given to a problem with over-promise and under-deliver. I'm thinking about the General Data Protection Regulation, for example, that I've heard ad nauseum as the answer to all the challenges of technology, and unfortunately has not really solved them, as we can see. And instead, what would be much more helpful is to look at solutions to the problems that we face, to do what is needed, and not so much look at the past or look at others or look at how well we've integrated coming from 27 different systems. To defend democracy, Arancha, thank you for putting that out there so clearly. Human rights, peace, and the rules-based order, with strength and with ambition. There is a risk that too much optimism becomes complacency. And now, here we are today, President Trump on his way to the White House. The end of an era. I'm sure it will be, even though it's hard to grasp at this moment how things will change, how quickly and how deeply. But we need to do more, and we need to do so in much, much more difficult circumstances, with Trumpism among us in Europe as well. The victory of Donald Trump, but also J.D. Vance, in many ways, is a victory of Silicon Valley. I'll say a little bit more about my recent studies and findings in my book, The Tech Coup, which when I wrote it, I could not have imagined how that would manifest with Elon Musk's role in the elections and the power that he will no doubt seek to get in return from his support of Donald Trump. It is a victory of venture capitalists, of tech executives, and it will widen the transatlantic rifts on tech policy. There will be fewer of the little hope that there was of US tech regulation being on the horizon. We will see rollbacks, and I'm sure that the executive order on artificial intelligence, but also on the exports of spyware, for example, things that we were aligned about, are very likely. We will also see more Silicon Valley informed foreign policy, which will have impact on relations with China, with India, with the EU, and more broadly. Just to name an illustration of what that could look like. Vice President-elect J.D. Vance threatened that the US would pull out of NATO if European lawmakers would impose more rules on Elon Musk's companies. This kind of mixing of corporate interests and geopolitics is what we must expect more of. And let me give you another example of something that I've seen from a relatively close distance, which is how the going after critics, people that revenge is sought against, could look like. We have seen in the academic world a real witch hunt after researchers into disinformation around elections since 2020. People have been brought before Congress to be heard under oath. There are court cases with lawyer costs numbering in the millions. And I'm afraid that this kind of approach will be repeated with the announced Council on Government Efficiency that Donald Trump has offered Elon Musk to lead and that he has accepted with honor. The idea of a purge comes to mind, and I would not be surprised that a lot of people will be leaving the United States, and I think that the EU should roll out the red carpet for academics that want to work while they enjoy academic freedom, and similarly for tech talent that we always seek, and now is a moment to reach out to those who may no longer feel that it's a good place for them to be. Now, what do we need instead of stubborn optimism? How about determined principlism? The notion of principlism, I thought about the word in my head and then I was like, does it even mean something? But it does. In bioethics, it's quite common, and it stands for the principles of respect for autonomy. So the very self-determination and sovereignty that we really need to double down on. Beneficence, so to do good for the common good. Non-malfeasance, to take responsibility for safety, and to foster justice. Stubborn optimism, or stubbornness and overly optimistic views of what the EU might be achieving, need to make place for a laser-focused determinism on what the EU needs now. Arancha said it very, very well. We need to double down on principles. I'm 100% sure that there will be a temptation towards pragmatism, that we will see fragmentation between EU member states, hoping that bilaterally they can have a little leg up vis-à-vis their neighbors, and that would be completely misguided. We should not water down. That's what needs more defending today than it did yesterday, even if there will be fewer of us standing for those principles. We should not compromise. I'm sure there will be compromise that happens, but we need to strengthen and not weaken our hand. Thank you so much.